I grew up in the city. I was a city kid, grew up on the north side of Chicago. My father was a plumber. My mother was right off the boat from Ireland, so I had no family experience in regard to that, but I did have a friend of mine who lived down the street, whose father was named Jim Palmer, former police officer, lived in my neighborhood, still lived in my neighborhood after he started on the floor in the early 70s. And he had some real success in those early 70 grain markets. And he brought his sons along with him, and his youngest son, who was my age, was the last one to come along. And I was going into my sophomore year of college, and I was working down at the other end of LaSalle Street at the clerk of the circuit court. I'd gotten a job with Morgan Finley's office. It's a political job. And just so happens he was downtown, and he had given me a call the night before and said, meet us for lunch, and why don't you come down to the board and we'll go to get lunch? And I'm like, I've never been to the board. I'll go take a look at it. Walked on the floor, and those days, literally, you could walk right on the floor. There was no turnstiles. There was no nothing. A couple security guards. Eddie Mansfield was still there, the original security guard for the Board of Trade floor. And you walked right into the old grain room, and it was literally a pit. It was a flat floor, and you walked down into it. Boards were everywhere, chalkboards still up, not being used, but they were up. And I just was mesmerized. I just saw it, and I was like, wow, this is a cool experience. Fast forward a few months, I decided I was not going to go back to college away at Northern. I decided to stay home. And my father said, well, you've got to do something besides take your classes. What else are you going to do? I said, I'd really like to work down at the Board of Trade. That was an interesting place. He knew a friend of his that ran a trading firm. His name was Don Hubner. He ran Merchants 230. Called me up that August. I got a job as a runner. It's the oldest story in the book about how people got started in this business, something that it's unfortunately just doesn't happen anymore, where you could find your way into this industry and make your way up or work your way through it. I went to Northern and decided, growing up in the city, why am I in the middle of DeKalb in a cornfield, and instead of being in the city where I know a lot of people. And I came back home, and I went to night school, went to junior college, finished up my associate's degree, and then I started working on the floor in the bond pit. Then I went back to night school again and finished up my undergrad at Northeastern. I was a history major. I knew I wanted to be on the floor. I didn't care about getting a specific degree. I decided to get a degree with something I was interested in, which was history. So I got my history degree, and I had little kids at the time, and it was more about finishing something like that. And, Mom wanted it done. She was from Ireland, wanted to see all of her kids graduate from college, and I was the last one to finish up. So I had an item because I started out trading night bonds, the night bond seat, and then I ended up leasing an AM. And at first, I just went out and found memberships to lease. And I had a backer when I started trading, and who I formerly clerked for, and we would just pay the monthly lease, which was more than my rent, more than my mortgage, and that's how I started out working through the membership process. Yeah, it was part of the game then that you had friends in the neighborhood or people you knew or relatives that shown interest in it, and usually you would. If the running position opened up, that's where they started. Or if they could be a clerk, maybe they would be a clerk. But you'd bring people on the floor, and they'd find their own way. And that's the beauty of this business then. It was you were going to sink or swim on your own. All you could do is make the introduction. A good story from that, though, was one of the people I got on the floor that ended up having a career for 20 years, ended up filling paper in the option pit. And first day in the pit, he was never had seen anything like that. He walked down the floor, and he looked up all the boards, and he looked around, and he said, who's winning? So it was very funny to look at it from the perspective of these are scoreboards, and how does he keep track of it? Because he didn't know anything about the industry till that day. It was significant because my parents didn't understand what I did. I don't know how many times they would ask me that. My in-laws at the time did not understand what I did, and it was always a very important question to answer when you were getting married or you were starting off your life. They wanted to know that you were going to be okay, and it was very difficult to explain to someone how it worked and the amount of risk was involved. And when you looked at someone and said, "Well, can you lose everything in your account?" and you looked at them and said, "I can lose everything and more," and that's the way it was, and you had to understand that going into it. My mother would hear she'd be listening to Orion Samuelson on WGN, and she'd hear a report and say the bonds were down or the stock market was down, and she'd call me up right away and, "Are you all right? Is everything all right?" Because she had no understanding of, I didn't care which way the market moved. As long as it moved, I was fine. So it was always an interesting topic in the house. I would have showed up 7 years earlier because when I got there, I got to see everything that was going on in the world of trading. All the changes from the old grain guys that had been there forever, been successful, had a lot of stories working on the grain floor, all the way to these new young financial traders that were coming into the industry and trying to find their way and make it work. By the time I had a chance to go in and trade, like I said, things had changed so much because the edge or the risk had changed in those pits. Location, where you stood, backing, everything changed. You couldn't get by on a small amount of money in terms of startup, and you needed to have opportunities to get those locations in the pit to get the access to the orders. I love the floor because of the microcosm it was and the world that it was. It was pretty simple. Your word was your bond. What you said goes, whether you were at the time a clerk or in the pit. If you weren't honest, people would realize very quickly. So it was very easy to be open and transparent because that's what was required. If you made a mistake, fess up to the mistake. You probably weren't going to get yelled at and screamed at, but you weren't going to lose your job. If you were caught lying, you were gone. Trust was everything. Trust was everything. So those memories of those people that you were in the trenches with every day were critical because you depended on them when you were in trouble, and sometimes they depended on you when you were in trouble. And generally, they were there from you. You knew who you could trust, and you leaned on those people. And those were the lessons you learned to take into trading as well. Getting screamed at, obviously, by your bosses or by other traders because you screwed up, or right before the open and you were out 30 or 40 contracts, you didn't know where they were. Those tense moments were very difficult. When you had a trade on in the pit and you couldn't get out of it, that was awful. It was an awful feeling. But those were all life lessons. You learn from those mistakes, you learn from those failures, and they've stood by me for a long time. Sometimes seeing people being bullied on the floor, how certain people would treat other people in an unkind way, unintentionally, unnecessarily, just because they could. I didn't like that. I didn't like that. The unknown every day, because you never knew what you were walking into. You just had to roll with it and be prepared. A lot of times it was very quiet, nothing going on. In an instant, it could go from quiet to deafening, and you had to be ready to make those reactions that quick. Everybody assumes you have to be some sort of mathematical genius. That might be more true now than it was then. You really just had to know how to roll with the punches and be ready to respond at any moment. It was fantastic. There was nothing more exciting on unemployment day on a Friday, right before that number came out, waiting and hearing the pin drop at 7:29 and 40 seconds in that pit with the anticipation and waiting for that number to come out, and then see it explode like a sporting event immediately for however long it took to settle everything down. So it was an awesome experience. I probably made $4,000, and that was a great day. That wasn't anywhere near some of the great days some of the big traders had, but it was exciting. It was exciting, but you had to temper that because you couldn't get as high on those days as you wanted in order to deal with the lows. I heard a story, and I knew the gentleman who did this, who if he had a winning day on the floor, he never would buy anything. He wouldn't buy his clothes. He wouldn't do anything. He wouldn't do that until he had a losing day. And he was a very good trader. So he'd be walking around with holes in his shirts. And next thing you know, you'd see him walking on the floor, brand new clothes, new car. He had a bad day. So that's one way he tempered it. He did it that way. So, I mean, you really had to be conscious of walking around. If you saw people walking around, jumping up and down over a great day, it was usually frowned upon because maybe someone else had a terrible day because it's a zero-sum game. Someone did. But also, what are you going to do on the bad days? Are you going to walk off the floor crying? No, you've got to have some sort of even keel about it. Worst trading day was terrible because it happened right on the close. Broker in front of me was about to bid for something on the close, and I was just trying to grab it. And he usually was bidding and offering for 30 or 40 lots. It wasn't a big broker. He went two bid 200. I said sold, and I didn't even. And once you say sold, that's it. It's yours. So I managed to peel off a few of them, and it was within the closing market. So usually that you close in the closing range. So I was trying to scalp it and get out. Well, right on the close, one of the bigger traders came in and pushed it lower, or pushed it higher, and I lost like 5 ticks on 130 contracts within 25 seconds. And I was up for the day. I thought I was going to go home happy. And it was a hard day because you don't have a chance to redeem yourself. It's over. You're done. You did what you did, and now walk off the floor and try to pick it up and come back the next day. I was always about being flat at the end of the day, never taking more than a 1-tick loss. There was always a number of traders down there that had experience that had a rules. Everett Klipp was a famous trader who founded Alpha Trading, and he taught a lot of people how to trade. And a lot of people followed Everett's rules, and he actually stood with you when you were new in the pit and made you follow those rules. So, I mean, I can't say I followed his rules, but I tried to be diligent to taking your losses, flattening out when you can, and taking your profits when they were there, and also letting profits run if you could. But, that was the style. And I started incorporating some technical analysis. I would go home and look at charts every night. I also would use the Stottlemyre program, Market Profile, which was available at a CQG terminal on the floor, which was the only one that offered it. And you'd sit in the pit and you'd draw a profile of the market throughout the day. And I thought it was a really good indicator. So I did use those to give me some idea of what was coming, or if it got to a certain price point, that what I was going to use for support and resistance, or where I thought market direction was going, brand new to the floor in '87. I had started that August, and I was working late in the afternoon in the grain room, and we were covering the Maxi Pit. And the Maxi Pit was an index pit. It was starting up, and it was getting some traction, and the board was excited about it as a competition to the S&Ps at the CME. And all of a sudden, at 2:45, everything went crazy. And I'm watching the stock market just crash. And the Maxi Pit, they're going crazy in there. And now phone's ringing off the hook. I'm a runner. One guy was on the phones. He's yelling at me, answer the phone, answer the phone. I'm 3 months into the business. Answer the phone, taking orders, running size orders into this pit. And these guys were not equipped to necessarily handle what was happening because it was usually pretty quiet. And that was historic, only to find out the next day that this was the crash in October that, everybody was talking about. And it was only, at one point, it was a 500-point move, which nowadays looks like nothing. But then, percentage-wise, it was huge. It was massive. I didn't have an opinion. It wasn't necessary because I was there to facilitate order flow. Did I want to be on a side of a bearish or bullish side of the market based on what was going on in the pit? Yes, if there was a lot of paper bidding or a lot of paper offering, I leaned on that. That was part of your job. But having an opinion doesn't help you when you're trying to react all the time. So being bullish or bearish, and it could just make you miss opportunity because your opportunity is to be in and out of that trade as quickly as you can. Not very many locals were position traders. Some were forced into it just because of the size they traded, but having an opinion was not encouraged. This is not something that necessarily happened to me. It's an interesting story because winners or losers, errors are bad. Yeah, you're trained immediately that when you have an error, you get out of an error. You don't wait. There's no playing with an error, whatever it is. So the worst error I was a part of was a $70,000 error to the positive. But because it was a $70,000 error to the positive, it was a confusion between a guy I was clerking for and another trader in the pit over 70 versus 7. In that story, he thought he did 70. She thought he did 7. Next day, we find out he came out $70,000 to the positive in the error. They split the error, $70,000 each. So it was big. It was huge. And scared him, scared me, because I didn't check the trade correctly. It was a winner, end of day, but easily shows you how you could put yourself out of business right away with a mistake, to the good or to the bad. Very intense, because usually you were looking at the cash to see maybe where you can get an idea where the market was going. You were looking at the overnight trade, whether it was overnight bonds at the time or whatever. But you were really looking to the brokers and the big traders to see where they were going to be. And then you tried to just get on the bid or get on the offer based on what you saw going on that open. And there were opportunities, so you had to be ready. You couldn't sit on your hands. Everything and anything to pass the time. Politics was talked about, which was dangerous. Religion, the markets themselves, getting to know the people around you. Because an interesting thing was, there were very few people from my neighborhood in there, so I got to know guys from the south side and guys from the north side, some guys that grew up out of state. They didn't grow up in Chicago or Illinois. So it was always an opportunity to state your opinion and hear a lot of opinions, because everybody had their own for sure. Just being me, brokers generally were fair. They generally were fair. They generally didn't want to hurt anybody. They knew what they could do with a specific trader based on their size. Just being myself, I think, and being, if I could help, I would help. If I couldn't, that they would understand that. So it wasn't. There were guys that went out of their way to get tickets and take them to games and do these different things, but I don't know if that helped. I don't think it did. I think at least the brokers I stood around were generally fair. They just wanted to do their job, which was to get that order off of their deck and filled, and they knew where to go with it depending on the size they had to get it done. That was always the mind game, because the other locals gave you an opportunity too, because if you knew someone was, a 10-lot trader, and all of a sudden you saw him get say sold to 40, there was an opportunity, because he might want to peel some of those off and lay it off, and you wanted to be there for them too in case they needed it. Sometimes you didn't want to be there for them, so you put your hands in your pockets. There were guys that would try to intimidate you and bully you in the pit and force you into things, and they thought that was a way to get over. But at the end of the day, it didn't help, because you were, again, in it together. When you were stuck and you were a good guy as a local, and you were dealing with another local and he could help and he appreciated the way you did your business, they would help if they could, and I would. I've seen times when I was in the pit and I was stuck and I'm turning to my side to say sold to something, I couldn't get it. To my left, someone else was saying sold to something, knew I needed it, and would give me some of it. They knew it. When I was first starting out, I was in the grain room, like I said, and I would get a phone call, and it usually was from a bar, you could tell. And I would get the question, what's the curb? I had no idea what the curb was. And I was yelled at then, go out and talk to so-and-so and find out what the curb is. So I'd run out, find out what it was, and see, it's half bid at 3/4. Sell me 40 at a half. I'm like, don't write it down. So I didn't know. I was just taking an order. So I'd go out there and I'd tell the broker or whoever, and it was just about seeing if anybody was there for the other side, not necessarily trading out of that. And it was necessary for some people at some times. And that's why they, altered those closes the way they did. I know there were other things going on down there, whether it was gambling or drugs or people bucketing trades or brokers front-running orders or clerks front-running their brokers' orders or things like that. You'd see that occasionally. But that was corrected very quickly usually if either the broker got wind of it or a bigger trader saw you doing something like that. Stealing trades from another trader was very much frowned upon, and you would get payback would be rough if you were not careful. The generosity down there was amazing. If someone was stuck or had a bad day or were in trouble, there were guys that would ante up and help out immediately to help those guys out. If someone's family was sick or child was sick, or if a clerk couldn't work and was sick, everybody would get together and find a way to help that clerk out. Because most of those guys didn't have health insurance. A lot of those people didn't have any kind of disability insurance, obviously, either. So there were so many different ways. If it was a charity that someone was involved in that hit close to home with a niece or a nephew, generosity was unbelievable. Whether it was donating tickets or just, here's cash. Do the next right thing. Be honest. Your word is your bond. It was great for that reason. And everybody thinks, wow, come on, couldn't have been like that. They were cheaters down there. Everybody was stealing money. Maybe there was people like that who wanted to take advantage of the system. But day in and day out lessons of being there for someone else and just standing up and being honest was critical to survival. My former trading boss, Mike Bloor, was a big mentor. Don Hubner, who ran Merchants 230, started in the business in the 60s, similar to the way I started, ended up owning a firm with his partner Al Zatopa that went on to be bought by ING Bank. And he would sit with me and talk to me. And then there were mentors that didn't know they were mentors, just watching them and how they operated and what they did every day. And Everett Clip I mentioned, but those guys that were doing it the right way, you wanted to learn from and pay attention to. In the grain room, it would have been definitely the O'Connor boys. Eddie O'Connor and Jack O'Connor. Eddie basically invented the option trade, and Jack was in the bean pit, and he was someone you'd watched. In the grain room, the bond room, obviously, Tom Baldwin. But then there was a trader, Charlie D. Francesco. I thought he was the greatest trader I've ever seen. I thought he was phenomenal to watch, how he operated, and not till after he died did I realize how great of a trader he really was. And watching the people that tried to follow him in his spot and try to take the paper he took and trade the way he did and couldn't do it, not even Tom. There was a guy in the mid-am pit who was paralyzed, went to Loyola Academy, playing rugby. And Charlie D met him. He was always interested in the markets, but he was in the chair. He wasn't going to be in the pit, obviously. Charlie said, "That's crazy. You can do this." And he backed him. And the guy would stand outside the mid-am pit, and he would arb orders into the mid-am pit, and he had a mid-am badge, and Charlie backed him till the day he died. And there's so many stories about him doing those things. He died literally in the pit. He came in that day, and I knew his clerks very well. They grew up in my neighborhood. And he had a flak jacket on. He wasn't supposed to be there. They went and took him out of the hospital, disconnected him from his machines, stood with their backs to his back to support him so he could have one last day in the pit. As you walk by them, these clerks, these tough guys, neighborhood guys, were in tears because they knew this was his last day. But he had to have it. He had to have that last chance. So it was he was a mesmerizing character. It was osmosis and experience. I was working as a desk clerk for merchants within maybe the second year I started, and I was in charge of the New York operation. Well, the New York operation was an office on the 27th floor of the Board of Trade building where I was put and basically had a phone, and I had a terminal. And this terminal, later to find out, was literally the first electronic terminal that they used. What it was a touch screen, which in 1987 was unheard of, that you'd punch the orders into. And it was literally a screen. And it wasn't a keypad or anything like that. And then this order would be delivered to the floor at the New York Mercantile Exchange or whatever you were sending the orders to and printed out and run in. Well, one day Don Hubner showed up in my office, and behind him was the chairman of the exchange at the time and a few other big shots. And I'm like, and he asked me, "Eddie, can you show us how we place an order? Just don't push send." And I typed it in, and Cocoa order or whatever, and they're watching this and they're amazed. And it literally, I'm like, who are? And so it just gave me an inkling that something was changing in our industry. We went from punch cards to terminals to now touch screens. And then you go to the floor and you see those changes happening in front of your eyes on the floor, from the option guys who would go down there with nothing. Then they had sheets and sheets of paper, and then they showed up with pads, and then, headsets showed up in the pit. That was a big deal, let alone hand signals, but headsets showed up in the middle of the pit. Phones in the pit was not common. So these technological changes were always part of this industry, always. I left the floor in '97, and a lot of my friends were like, well, you got out at the right time, because there was still an opportunity to stay within the business then and go do something else within the industry. I love the industry. I didn't want to lose that experience. So I ended up going to work for a smaller firm that specialized in managed futures. And all they did was CTA, or letter direction business. So when I left the floor, it was just another opportunity for me to learn. I was always interested in doing multiple things, and I was given the opportunity there, being a smaller firm, to run my own sales team and do my own, sign off on my compliance work. And so I was exposed to a whole other side of the industry that benefited me now, that it was allowed me to stay in the business.